So Savannah Dodd runs the Photography Ethics Center, and Savannah, we spoke about an agenda of ethics last December the 7th, actually. And then we thought it was important this time to also, given the events in Ukraine and the significance of those issues, to kind of not just revisit some of the things that we were talking about, but also seeing how the perspective that we discussed back in December plays out in a circumstance like this for photographers, for photo editors, for consumers of information, and so on. And so to begin, one of the things is, I think that when we're dealing with an issue like conflict in Ukraine, we have to take into account kind of the broad spectrum of what I would call, following an anthropologist like yourself, Deborah Poole, the visual economy. And I like that notion of the visual economy because it talks about kind of a structured organization of things. We, by and large, do not get to see things by accident. It's through a set of processes, relations, institutions, and so on that it comes about. How would you summarize what you're seeing from Ukraine at the moment? Is it possible to summarize? Is there a constant theme, or are there a huge array of different things that you're seeing?
I'd say that there's a huge array. I find it really hard to summarize anything. And I mean, I think that this is something that we've discussed earlier, and that you might touch on, that there's also so many different media and forms of media and platforms. And I think that also really influences the type of visual data that we receive through those platforms. I think we are seeing, I think a lot of times in the past, there's been a lot of criticism that, if conflicts are portraying people of color, that there's a lot more graphic content. And I'd say in this case, there's been quite a lot of graphic photographs coming out. And that's been really interesting to see. And as well, we'll talk about this later, but how that's been contextualized, I think, is something that maybe is a learning point for, going forward in photojournalism in the industry, that could be applied to other conflicts as well in the future.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's very hard to summarize. I'll be interested to kind of hear the views of people in the audience as to whether or not they've identified any particular themes and so on. One of the things that I feel is that, unlike conflicts where the United States or Western nations or Britain or whatever involved, I mean, those countries have very elaborate systems of working with the media. They embed journalists with units. It gives a very particular kind of fighting eye perspective on conflict and so on. And I think that's absent in the coverage that we're seeing here. It seems much more sporadic, at a distance, people struggling to get access, and so on. What's your sense of that, about kind of the perspective we have on conflict itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we're getting a lot of photographs as well of people, just everyday people taking actions. And I think that that's really been quite interesting. And maybe even more of the sort of mundane moments of conflict, of people sheltering, of maybe less frontline, so more focused on the everyday lived experience of people in a conflict situation, which I don't think is something that you would maybe get as much of normally, and quite rightly, like you said, probably because of the embedding that happens a lot of times in other conflicts.
Yeah. we were talking a little earlier, and now I'm going to age myself terribly. I don't have a TikTok account. I've never actually watched a TikTok video, but there's a lot of commentary, of course, that a lot of visual information about this conflict is going on platforms like TikTok, and also through private networks on Telegram, which is like WhatsApp and so on. So not public networks. They might be collective, but they're not entirely public. I have a sense that that is hugely significant. I saw a statistic earlier today that there'd been something like 30 billion views of videos on TikTok with Ukraine as a hashtag. Influencers who are starting to do first-person reports and so on. And at the same time, because it's a platform that's easy to upload video to, there's a lot of concern about misinformation and disinformation on the platform because it can repurpose video from other sources very readily. And that leads me to think that we're going to talk about some very significant and important photojournalistic images, but they're not where most people get their information from in a conflict like this. At the same time, they have kind of an outsized importance because legacy media platforms, New York Times, Associated Press, Guardian, commission them, produce them, and run with them. So people who read those websites or newspapers do consume a lot of photojournalism. Do you have any sense of kind of the broad spectrum of the visual economy and where photojournalism fits in it, and whether that provides particular challenges for thinking about the ethics of these images?
I mean, I'm also not on TikTok, so I can't really speak to that angle of it. But I think it really connects to just a wider conversation that's happening across photojournalism and across the industry, and that's been happening for some time, about the democratization of media and this first, crowdsourced, reporting and stuff. I think that definitely plays a massive role. I think also the way, as individuals who are not trained in photojournalism or in photography or in visual methods, there's going to be a different set of skills, right, than the skills that professional visual storytellers will bring to a situation. So I think also, so I guess what I'm trying to say with that is, I think that in the past, there's been a little bit of a concern that like, well, what's going to happen to the profession of photojournalism? But I don't think that that's really under threat, because I do think that, photographers, visual storytellers are coming in with a set of skills to tell visual stories. And that is something that's really valuable. At the same time, I think that when people themselves are producing content, they're going to be replicating a lot of the tropes and a lot of the things that they've seen produced and put out in reputable news sources like the New York Times, for example. So I think that there is a conversation that's happening between the different levels. And I think that photojournalism plays a major role in leading what that conversation or what that visual discourse is going to look like. So while we're not going to be talking maybe more about the crowdsourced imagery and things like that, I think it's all part of that same visual dialogue and discourse that's happening. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because particularly when there's no embeddings and there's no easy access. I mean, I've done audio interviews with Ron Haviv talking about the fact that it's very difficult to get access to the Ukrainian military. You can't get to the front line around Kyiv very easily, if at all. So without that perspective, then when a battle takes place or conflict takes place, what we're seeing are videos clearly recorded on smartphones by citizens of the city, or potentially even soldiers, I guess, in some circumstances. Sometimes we don't know. And they're the things that you will see on BBC television news, or the American equivalents or the European equivalents of that, missiles hitting buildings and so on. In large part, I think those things are coming from crowdsourcing, actually, from the public. We'd have to do a proper content analysis and work that out, but I just have that sense, you tell by the vertical framing and so on, that that's taking place. And that gets to the point, of course, that unless something happens right in front of you, for most photographers, you are structurally late to the event. which is, I think in most cases, actually a virtue because you have some time to find out about context. But it's not what provides the instant images of an event actually taking place. Perhaps sometimes that's a tension within photojournalism about how much it is spot news versus stories and so on.
I think an interesting element to what you're saying as well, because it's a very different thing, isn't it? When crowdsourced video footage is being uploaded to TikTok than when it's being broadcast through the BBC, right?
Yeah.
And that's different on many different levels. First of all, you've got different levels of editorial decision making, right?
Yeah.
When media is being selected, right? It goes through conversations with colleagues about what's appropriate, what's accurate, what's been verified, things like that. Also, reach and responsibility differs a lot, right? Because individuals might have a huge reach on their social media, or they might not have any reach at all, really. So, there's the amplification of things in different audiences as well. But then also, I think it's really interesting to think about how images are contextualized, especially when they're happening, or even when photojournalistic images are being repurposed on Instagram or on Twitter, right? Because most people, well, you're saying a lot of people use social media as their news, but for most people, it wouldn't be an exclusively news source, right? You'll have cat videos and memes and interspersed with traumatic imagery of conflict, and so it's a very different way that I think people interact with those photographs and read those photographs in those different contexts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, even in a circumstance like this, most people don't pay close attention to the news, and therefore it's certain image, and that's where I think certain images kind of, if they break through, are the ones that become, in the wrong use of the term, iconic, because they're repeated and so on. Now we had one of those, and now obviously when it comes to conflict, one of the biggest things, of course, is the question of how graphic are the images, what's the decision-making process behind showing them, what's the justification for showing them or not showing them. And probably one of the most prominent ones is of a family who was killed by shelling, an event that took place right in front of the photojournalist Lindsay Addario. So let's talk through that as an example, and I'd also be very interested in hearing from people in the audience, their reaction to this image. If people haven't thought about it or seen it, there's a whole podcast actually on this photograph on the New York Times podcast series, The Daily. It's called The Story Behind a Defining War Photo. So, warning, graphic image coming up showing the photograph that Lindsay took, and it's of this family that was killed by mortar fire near a bridge. Civilians were trying to escape and flee. And as she explains in the podcast, this was something that took place right in front of her, which is quite unusual, I think, rather than seeing it later. When you saw this for the first time with your ethics hat on, what did you think?
I thought I wanted to learn more about the background to it. That's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but I was really curious to learn more about the context in which the photograph was made, and because it is a very unusual decision to decide to publish a photograph of people who are dead or dying with their faces identifiable. So that I think that I was surprised that ran, and I was interested in learning more about the decision making behind that and the context in which it was photographed. In the podcast, Lindsay Addario says that really her intention behind taking those photographs was to make a record of a war crime. And I think that really struck me and made a lot of sense, because again, we were talking a little bit about the context of publication. There are two levels of decision making that are happening, with a photograph such as this one. First of all, you've got the decision to, well, many levels of decision making, but two main ones, I guess, the decision to take it and the decision to publish it. And I know a lot of photographers who I've spoken with as well have said that you take it in the moment and you can decide later, and different people have different position on that. I think in context of war crimes, I think that makes a lot of sense personally, because that could be very valuable evidence, visual evidence for legally in the future.
I think that you've hit on one of the really crucial points there. And so what is interesting about the podcast the New York Times did on this is it gives you a little insight into that decision-making process. So that once Lindsay has taken the photograph, she checks that she's actually captured the moment that has taken place. And she immediately contacts her editor to say that she's filing extraordinarily sensitive images, not expecting them to be used, actually, according to the podcast. And then somewhat surprised to find that it led the homepage of the website and the front page of the newspaper. And that was something that was a very conscious decision by the photo editors. And then the director of photography says, actually, it went all the way up the editorial chain in the New York Times to make the decision to use that photograph. And I think this is extremely important because it does show that this is quite a rare and unusual thing to happen. We'd have to do a content analysis to say we're seeing lots of graphic images or not many graphic images and so on. My personal sense is we're not seeing a huge number, certainly relative to the conflict itself, and that is probably, that's explainable by the way in which graphic images are handled by organizations generally. And I think we also have to bring in the question of race and ethnicity and how Ukraine is perceived and so on. And we'd have to look at a similar conflict, a similar situation in a non-European, non-white location to make a judgment about whether there were more graphic images or less. I don't think it's very easy to say one way or the other. Though I do think that there are still those decisions at the tops of organizations, even when it's outside of Europe. They may make different decisions, but it goes through quite a complex process, which again underscores the point I started with about a visual economy and the point you made, that there are the decisions to take the photographs, to circulate them, and then to publish them. And then, of course, we'll come to this later, there's the decision on individuals like us to consume them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is quite hard to sort of objectively say, right, there are more or there are fewer photographs of, people dead and dying coming out of Ukraine than in other conflicts in the world. However, I do think that there is a difference in the level of context that we get about people. Right. And I think that's a really important key. And maybe this is something you wanted to get into later. So sorry if I'm jumping the gun a wee bit there. Do you want me to hold that thought or?
No, carry on.
Yeah. Because I think that, when we're making editorial decisions, about people who are in very traumatic situations, right? There are lots of critiques against them. And I guess a couple of the main critiques are really, first, that it's voyeuristic, that it's not appropriate to look at photographs. And then also there's the charge of compassion fatigue, that if we look, we'll stop caring. And I think, as you've pointed out in a previous article, unless I'm misunderstood your article, these points can be quite contradictory in a lot of situations. I think an interesting example of this is John Taylor, who wrote Body Horror. He writes that photographs of trauma can exonerate the viewer from shame. They can look at indecent images with impunity and without any obligation to intervene. Contrastingly, Frank Muller's written that graphic photographs are even a kind of violence against the viewer, because it's impossible to have the right response to photographs. And then others have said, that we're no longer shocked by images. That's that compassion fatigue argument again. And I think a lot of this comes down to like, how are we portraying people, right? What's the context in which these images are being portrayed and consumed? And I think that there are a couple kind of key elements that can work to ensure dignity of people in photographs, even when they're being portrayed in incredibly vulnerable, incredibly traumatic situations. One of these things is to avoid sensationalism.
Yeah.
So, I think photographs like those made by Anastasia Taylor Lend are great examples. I think she's created a lot of really sensitive portraits that are a really delicate way of looking at sort of the human experience of traumatic situations without sort of portraying maybe graphic imagery or sensational imagery.
Yeah.
But when we do, have photographs like Lindsay Adaria's, that the decision is taken that actually this is a really important photograph, this needs to be seen. I think one thing that can be done to ensure the dignity of people is to provide context. And I think that really happened in this case. I think after the publication, Lindsay Adaria went back to find family and friends. We end up learning so much, about the father, Sergei, and the children and his wife Tatiana and their lives, and the church worker who was helping them. We get that richness of understanding who they were as individuals. Yeah. And I think that that's really key when we're using traumatic imagery. Yeah. I think that has been done quite well in this example. And I think that in contexts where photographs are of people of color in suffering, I think that is generally done much less well.
Yeah.
That was a very long response to your comment. I apologize.
We'll come back to think about those. I'll just bring in a couple of comments. So Adrian makes a response into Lindsay's photos. I know of very few better examples of why we exist, we being photographers, period. Extraordinary and courageous by both Lindsay and the editorial, superb job. And I think for the reasons that you just outlined there, in terms of both documenting war crime, which is something that Lindsay talks about in the podcast. And I know that when I've interviewed Ron in Kiev, it's the same thing. The purpose is not to photograph horror for the sake of horror. It's actually to document these things so that hopefully in some post-conflict situation, first of all, there's an historical record that can't be denied. And then secondly, action might be able to be taken. And we've seen that previously in Bosnia, where photographs have played a very significant role in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in bringing cases against people. So I agree with that. Audrey says in response to the photo, when I first saw it, I was shocked because it was unprecedented for the New York Times to publish such an image. I listened to Adaria's caption, the description. She was interviewed a few days later on CNN and talked more about it and how other images she's made cannot be shown. And I think that is also an interesting point, is that I am sure that every photographer there has images much more graphic that they will have taken for the historical record, which are not going to see the light of day in a media organization, and are probably not filed. I mean, before this event, I looked at Ron Haviv's images on the Seven Agency website, and there's nearly 900 images now from Ukraine. And I think in that I counted 5 scenes in which there were dead bodies out of the 900 images, or a couple of images for each scene, shall we say. Often at a distance, not showing a face, very discreet in that sense, but a very small number of the images even filed with the agency, and then that'll be an even smaller number used by media organizations afterwards. But on memory cards, there are going to be many more records of completely horrific things. But we're not going to see those. And so the counterpoint would be, of course, that we should see more, that as graphic and as disturbing as Lindsay's photo is, given the nature of war, we should see more to have an accurate and realistic portrayal. What do you think about that?
I think that all of these decisions about, what is or isn't appropriate, what should or shouldn't be seen, are so case by case. And I think it's really impossible to have a blanket statement about, we should see more, or should see less. But I also think that the idea that we can ever really get the whole reality of what's happening, and we can ever really understand it or really see all elements of it, is flawed to begin with. I think that there's always going to be elements that we won't have access to. In this case, in Ukraine, like you said, there's no embedding, and there's actually a lot of restriction on photographers being able to see the front lines. So, we're not seeing very much frontline photography. Do we need to see more of that to actually know what's happening? I don't know that we do. I think we have a pretty good sense, I would think, of what's happening, and that the photographs that are being chosen and are being published are filling that need.
Yeah. And a lot of it is a conscious decision on the part of photographers to picture the impact on civilians, for example. So Mickey makes the point from the audience, I wonder if instead of action and dramatic, both inverted commas, classic war images, because of the lack of access, we get a lot of refugee coverage, which is more compelling and perhaps kind, and maybe even more so compared to coverage of other populations. Is that connected? So are we seeing more of civilian consequences, refugees, because there's less access at the front, or is that coming about for a different reason? You want to speculate on that?
I don't know that I could speculate on that.
Yeah.
I mean, potentially, I think it's definitely connected. And I think, the way that people are being represented and portrayed, compared, as you said, Mickey, to coverage of other populations, absolutely. I think that there will be a differential in terms of maybe favorable representation, because Ukrainians are white. And I think that there will inevitably that will play out in the visual representation inevitably. Yeah. But I mean, in terms of, a wider, as you said, content analysis point on that, I couldn't speculate.
Yeah. Someone's asked, I'm curious about the argument that choosing not to run graphic or exceptionally violent images diminishes the reality of war. Shouldn't the world be seeing these images so we can understand how awful war is? Touched a little bit on that, but that's the question. You made the point that it's extremely difficult to provide a comprehensive view. I think that's the case in most situations and most conflicts, but we have pretended in the past we probably had a comprehensive view. This one, I feel, is demonstrating to us we don't have a comprehensive view. I mean, particularly as Ukraine is a country the size of France, we're focused on certain cities that are being targeted, quite rightly, of course. But there are lots of situations where normal life is, well, it's not normal life, but it's life outside of the firing line, I suppose we would describe it as, is taking place. I mean, I saw a diagram recently that most Ukrainian railways are still running, except in heavily occupied areas. So that's the balance. I mean, can we say more about, well, is it a balance? Are we trying to balance things? How do we think about providing a comprehensive view, and how graphic do we have to be to give that comprehensive view?
So I think that's a really good question. And I think that, I mean, I'm not a photojournalist myself, disclaimer, I've not photographed conflict, but from what I've read, a lot of conflict is not the photographs that we see are the small sliver of action in a lot of wider conflicts. Whether or not that holds true in the case of Ukraine, I couldn't speak to that, but and I think that that's an important thing to remember, because I think that when we see photographs a lot of times from armed conflict, it looks like it's constantly heat of the action, but that's not the lived experience. And I think, media outlets are wanting to show things that are newsworthy. So is the mundane newsworthy? I don't know. I mean, I think it might be, but it's not often what's been shown and what's been portrayed. So, and yes, in terms of how much graphic content we need to see in order to really understand it, there are lots of arguments on sort of both sides of the aisle about that. One argument would say that actually portraying graphic imagery turns people off and doesn't provoke people to think. It just provokes pity. And that pity isn't a useful emotion, that actually if we show things that are a little bit more askance, looking askance is one trend discussed in this book, Picturing Atrocity, which is quite a good book. I think you have a chapter in it, actually. It's a really useful book for thinking about these things. And there's a chapter on looking askance that talks about how actually when we approach things obliquely, when we're not showing the full frontal violence, it draws people into an image and they start to ask questions. But when you have something that is affronting to people, it doesn't elicit the same response, or it doesn't elicit as engaged of a viewer. Basically.
I mean, I think there's there's a lot of work to be done here generally, let alone in relationship to Ukraine, because I don't think intellectually we know all that much about how people respond to images. I think in most cases arguments are made, critics make claims that people respond in this way or that way, and that's the compassion fatigue argument, right? Is that people get desensitized, as though it's a psychological process that after a certain number of images, psychologically, you just become somehow emotionally numb. I think this is nonsense and should be debunked. But I do think that people, counter to that, I think people either decide to look or decide not to look, or just to look a little bit. I think it's a conscious decision. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all make that decision, because you cannot look at disturbing imagery all day long. And we know, in fact, that people who work in content moderation and so on end up with PTSD looking at disturbing imagery all day long. And as citizens, we have other dimensions to our lives, even when we're consuming these news. And we have to admit that on some occasions, maybe many occasions, we turn away. But we don't do it because we've been psychologically numbed. We do it because we need a coping strategy, because to look at this stuff constantly, even the way it's shown in the media generally, becomes too disturbing. Anyway, I think we need much more work on how people consume images and how the audience reacts to these things.
Well, that was something that you discussed in an article that you wrote about in 2012, I think it was, about mobilizing a collective political response, right? Is that's sort of along those same lines, is it not?
Yes, exactly.
Because we don't have a good, we don't know how to respond to images, and we don't know how to view images ethically. And I think that's, I completely agree with you that more, that's an area for more work.
I mean, we get, rightly, an image like Lindsay's gets a lot of attention. And the good thing is that she's gotten a lot of attention, and then she's gone on to explain the context and the circumstances, as we've discussed. So we've learned a lot more about that. And just as an aside on that, in the podcast, she asked the father whether or not he would have given consent for that image to have been published. And he said, yes, absolutely. He wanted that documented, which I think does happen in a lot of those circumstances, that even in the worst situations, and that comes back to a discussion we had last time about retrospective consent. You can say, okay, it was too late by then, but it's still, to me, very interesting that the father said that.
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting. I mean, this is a different case and a different context, but I think it is interesting to think as well about, this father's experience of seeing that photograph, because he actually found out about the photograph through Twitter. I mean, he found out about his family's death through social media.
Yes.
And I think I think there are a couple things in that are really important. One is that he recognized them by their belongings.
Yes.
And I think that's something that we don't always think about as people being identifiable by their shoes. But we are, our loved ones know what our shoes look like. Like that's And so to say, well, people's faces aren't shown, therefore their family won't know or won't be impacted by these photographs, I think is a little bit of a false assumption.
Yeah.
The other thing, I guess, is, I think it is very useful to hear that he would have given consent. I think it's very interesting to sort of contrast it with the case of Alan Kurdi and
Right.
his father,
Yeah.
and how his father was sort of affronted with lots of photographs of his body,
Yeah.
and how that photograph became a bit of an icon,
Yeah.
and lost meaning.
Yeah.
Lost, I think people there, it's talked about in the mini documentary Sea of Pictures, I think it's
Mhm.
called, and they talk about that in that documentary as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Got a couple of questions here about one from James about what do you think of journalists, photojournalists allegedly being targeted for kidnapping by Russian forces to be then coerced into recanting what they've been reporting as fake. That's a really important issue, and it does bring to mind, I'll just share the screen for this. This, of course, has come up in part because, and tell me if you can see this Associated Press article. Can you see that okay?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Responding in the chat to a couple of things.
Yeah. So, and there's another question also about thoughts on foreign versus local photographers, and so on. Now, in this case, Evgeny Malaletka is a Ukrainian freelance photographer who's a stringer for AP, and he, along with Chernov, have been the only recognized international media inside Mariupol until very, very recently, last few days. And they did these extraordinarily powerful, detailed and moving reports about, as they say, the descent of Mariupol into despair and destruction. First thing to observe, of course, is that the lead photograph is of a mass grave, and these workers in Mariupol were coming out to quickly bury civilians in between shelling, and so on. And this is, I think, the most common way we see this sort of imagery, and that is you will see someone's legs, no face, no possibility of being identified and so on, but you're left in no doubt as to what's going on. And similarly, as you go through the article, you'll see a body covered with a tarpaulin, and so on. There's more of that. I mean, if people have not seen this article, in a moment I'll drop the link into the chat, because I recommend it. But I was thinking about that in relationship to those questions, because Malaletka and Chernov have had to flee Mariupol because they found out that the Russians were coming for them, and the Ukrainian military turned up. So that story is in this article, the team that documented the city's agony. Ukrainian military turned up and wanted to know where the journalists were, and they were worried for themselves, but actually the Ukrainian military was like, you have to get out of the city now. And the reason we want you out is because if you get captured, the Russians are going to make you confess on video that you faked all those images and all your work documenting those images. So they say here, they were told by the military, if they catch you, they'll get you on camera and they'll make you say that everything you filmed is a lie. All your efforts and everything you've done in Mariupol will be in vain. I mean, it's a really, and they managed to get out. It's a dramatic story, but it really illustrates, even for an invading force like Russia, and with lots of disinformation produced in Russia about this conflict, they fear the prospect of these images. And some of these images have been used in political fora, the UN and so on, and they would like to discredit that. And so there's kind of a reverse backhanded compliment, not quite the right phrase, but that this work is really significant. So significant that they wanted to capture the people who made it.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, I think that that sort of, thinking about a lot of these things like, portraying people with dignity and, excuse me, whether photographs should be published or not published. I think a lot of these conversations and, whether something constitutes voyeurism or, is part of the public, if there's a public need to see photographs. I mean, I think all of these questions really come down to the ultimate question, which is, do photographs do the work that they need to do? Like, are they actually that powerful? Are they actually as impactful as we're assuming them to be? Or is that valid justification for sharing these photographs or for taking these photographs? Or and I think that this, the fact that Russia is so concerned, or Putin in particular is so concerned about these photographs is really a testament to their power, right? That actually, it must be powerful because there's such a restriction on photographs in Russia right now. So I definitely do think, I agree with you.
Yeah, so we've got various links in there. Thank you very much to Catherine, who put some of those in before I realized, but those links to those AP articles are there. And I think this is also significant in terms of the local versus international photographer, because both Chernov and Malaletka are Ukrainian. Chernov is videographer and a journalist, was living in Germany, came back. Malaletka lived in or near Mariupol. That's his home. At the same time, it's not a complete contrast because they're stringers for Associated Press. And so they're part of the international visual economy through that. And thankfully, that's allowing their work to come out and have much wider audience. So I guess on the one hand, what that demonstrates is the importance of local photographers who are committed to documenting in that city until the last possible moment. And I'm very glad that they went with the military and escaped, because I think their lives were seriously in danger. But it's not, the local versus international is not a black and white distinction either, because they're working for Associated Press and so on. So there's an overlap between those things.
Absolutely. I think as well, I'd just like to add, there are a lot of foreign journalists in Ukraine right now as well. I think it was 2,000, admissions. I forget the term, but of foreign journalists have happened. And that's a huge number for foreign journalists. And I do think that there's a question, as I think the person who asked the question said, in terms of experience, there's a big question of liability as well. Like when a bunch of, international photographers are coming into a conflict situation, there is the question of, well, what danger are they adding to the situation as well? Are they adequately prepared? Also, if they do become in a situation of danger, will they be putting other people in danger to get them out of a situation? And then what about as well, I mean, it does make you wonder as well about resources, if food does become scarce, or if there, are other resource issues, will 2,000 is not a huge number, but it could definitely contribute, so I think it's really important. I guess what I'm trying to say is for photojournalists to really check in with themselves and make sure that it's necessary for them to travel, first of all, for their own safety, because that's incredibly important. And it shouldn't just be assumed that photojournalists put themselves in situations of danger. I don't think that that's constructive for anybody for that to be sort of an underlying assumption, although it sort of is. And unfortunately, because that's sort of a sort of a myth of the industry, I think that persists. But as well, are you adequately prepared? So why are you going? Do you need to be there? Are you adequately prepared? Have you done heat FAT training? Do you have the right equipment? Do you know first aid? Like, all of these questions need to be interrogated really seriously, I think, before putting yourself in a situation like Ukraine right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to post on Insider later today or tomorrow, hopefully, a video dispatch from Ilvi, who's been working in Lviv, and she made two interesting observations about that. One is she was surprised at the number of people who were turning up as freelancers who were not equipped in any way, without helmets, flak jackets, and the like, and were searching for that stuff once they had arrived, which seems a poor level of preparation. And that she was delayed going precisely because even though she had insurance, once the war started, the insurance was cancelled and did not apply to Ukraine. So then she had to source other forms of other insurance to get that. And I think these are just, happily, A, she was prepared, B, she got insurance, she'd done training, etc. All those things are absolutely crucial. You cannot put yourself into a circumstance without those basics, because, as you say, you will then put other people's lives in danger, trying to rescue out of circumstances that you should have been prepared for.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, to think about trying to source a helmet or flak jacket when you're in Ukraine, that's also taking away gear from someone else who might need it as well. I feel like you coming into that situation, you really need to be not draining the resources in a context like that. Absolutely. And as well, I think thinking about preparation and thinking about things like that, it's also really relevant for thinking about moral injury. I think moral injury is defined by the Moral Injury Project, for those who might not be familiar with the term, as the damage done to one's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress their own moral and ethical values or codes of conduct. And I think moral injury is a real danger for photojournalists at all times, but particularly in times of such traumatic conflict. And I think, it's really, I think that there are a lot of things that can help alleviate moral injury. And I think a lot of those things have to do with ethics, actually. I think that if you have a really strong understanding of why you're there, why you're in that situation, why you're doing what you're doing, really strong foundations on maybe the ethics of witnessing or an ethical imperative to document war crimes, for example. If you know why you're there and what you're doing there, then you have a purpose in that situation, and you're not being a passive bystander. And I think that can be very helpful for just framing as well in your own head about your role. But as well, I think having an ethical practice is also really useful to that, because you can leave the situation knowing that you acted within your own ethics. You have no I was going to say no regrets, but we all have regrets. That's a silly thing. But you know that your work is underpinned by your own principles, and you can rest easy in that way. And I do think that ethics could go a long way towards assisting and alleviating with moral injury.
Well, and especially as we discussed back in December, and is kind of informing this discussion as well, this is understanding ethics as an orientation and an approach and a set of questions and a constant reflection, not simply a code that you tick off, sign, and so on, but a completely ongoing process of reflection here about these things.
No, absolutely. I think that's really, really important. I think ethics is something that is subjective and contextual. It's something that we're constantly having to negotiate and to learn from experiences and to learn from others. And I think it is something that's constantly evolving. Absolutely.
Yeah. There were a couple of observations about whether or not the targeting of those two journalists by the Russians was unique or a first-time thing. And I think I have very broad examples, but I don't think it is sadly new. I think that journalists are targeted by military forces in conflict surprisingly regularly. I think that account that we got from Mariupol of the fact that they were being hunted, and there are reports of, not only for journalists, but also intellectuals and other community leaders, that there are lists of individuals who are either being rounded up, taken away, abducted, or sometimes shot, shows what's going on there. But I don't think it is, sadly, unique that journalists are targeted like that.
I do think as well, sometimes, I don't know about it doesn't seem like this case in particular was necessarily impacted by the fact that they were Ukrainian.
Yeah.
It could have been, but I would say, or would add to this, that a lot of times local photographers, journalists, fixers can be in a lot more danger than international journalists. And I think that's an important point to make, because I think, especially when we think about fixers, fixers are a lot of times not given their due credit. And I think they take on an undue burden of risk compared to really the recognition that they receive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they do more than fix things. They're actually essential parts of the entire journalistic process. I mean, I've seen some people refer to them as producers, and I mean, they're journalists themselves. And there was a circumstance where there was a Fox News correspondent who was killed, and at the same time, the Ukrainian fixer producer was also killed, and that person was not named by Fox at all in the reports, which was really poor, and ignores the fact that we wouldn't be seeing these things without those local individuals supporting people and so on. Again, Ylvi will talk about that in her dispatch, and it's very interesting how she came to work with someone and so on. It's a really, really good insight into that. There have been some images about, I think who was asking that question? I think it was, sorry, I can't see you ask that question, but these are images of, quote, lynching. It's not lynching in the American sense, but they're people who have been caught looting by Ukrainian authorities. They are stuck to poles. They then have potatoes stuck in their mouths, and they're going to be taken away by the police to be prosecuted. And we can see their faces very clearly. I don't know if you've seen those images at all.
I haven't yet, no.
I'll share screen and show you one of those.
Okay.
So they've been taped, glad wrapped, unbelievably, to poles, potatoes in their mouths is obviously some form of insult, and so on. And they're going to be taken away by the police. They've looted stores and so on, which is, perfectly. It's not a matter of defending it or not defending it, but this is what happens in conflict zones. Mm-hmm. What's your reaction to that image? And I've not seen any published in the media as such. I've seen them taken and so on.
That's what I was going to ask, is where has it been published? I mean, again, this is a little bit different, but it's similar, so there are those different levels of decision making, right? There's the taking of the image and the sharing or publishing or just sharing of an image. And yes, I'm not sure what the purpose would be of taking those photographs. It seems that sharing those photographs doesn't serve the public good necessarily. I don't know what we learned from those photographs. And I think as well, I mean, this is a time of trauma and conflict for everybody. And I think, even perpetrators need to be regarded with some sense of dignity. Even thinking about, Russian soldiers, they're victims as well in many ways of Putin's war. They are a lot of times very young and don't have access to information that would prevent them from, or that would encourage them to maybe lay down their weapons. And I do think that this line between victim and perpetrator is very, very fuzzy a lot of times. So I even, even when they're, I tend to shy away from photographs that portray anybody with undue lack of dignity.
Yeah. So a little bit more context. Actually, it was Carol who asked that question, and it says that importantly, these people were not caught by the police or military, but they were caught by the crowd, by a civilian crowd, and that's why they're taped to a pole and so on. I think, as I understand it, they are going to be picked up by the police later, or at least that was the hope of the crowd. Okay. Carol, I'd be interested in your thoughts if you think the image is justified or not. Daniel points out that the only place he's seen that photograph I showed was taken by Ron Aviv in Kiev, and he shared it on his Instagram. So it was portrayed there, but I don't think it's been published in a media outlet as such for that. And Lauren points out rightly, yes, Eric Bouvet is another seven photographer in Kiev had taken similar photos as well.
I mean, like anything, it's all very contextual and very subjective. I think personally, I think those are sensitive photographs in a lot of ways, and I think care is advised with photographs in terms of what lasting damage it could do for the people in the photographs, in terms of impact.
I think we can debate about whether it's right to show the face or not show the face and so on. At the same time, I mean, there are plenty, even in our domestic media in Europe and so on, people who are arrested for crimes, even before being tried, are often pictured on the way into court or so on. So it's not entirely different from some of the sort of criminal coverage.
That's true. However, in cases like that, you might find out the resolution of, the case is, they've been found guilty, or they've been found innocent, or there's been insufficient proof. So I think, there is sort of on the public record, there would still be a resolution to that case. Whereas in a situation like this, people are sort of frozen in time as a perpetrator being humiliated publicly. And I think that is a difference.
I think the questions to ask about that. At the same time, I think it's one thing we don't see is because of the way in which the coverage has gone, and quite rightly, we've focused upon the extraordinary resistance of Ukrainian forces to Russian forces and so on. We've not seen any internal division within Ukraine. And I'm not saying that should be played up or searched for or whatever. But this, which shows in one way that some looting has taken place, that some parts of the civilian population have taken some vigilante action in response to us. To me, that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of the wider situation of what conflict does in a community.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there might be value in. I mean, I definitely don't want to say there's no value in taking the photograph. It does seem like, visual evidence is important in conflict, full stop. It's important to have those photographs somewhere, whether or not social media isn't the best outlet for them, I think could be interrogated. But I think that Carol's point that in the comments there is super important as well. That, was this done for the cameras? Yes. And I think that's another incredibly, thank you very much to Carol for bringing that up, because we've not talked about that at all, is authenticity. I mean, I think it goes to what somebody was saying earlier as well about, disinformation campaigns and authenticity when we're looking at conflict. People perform for cameras. That's a fact. And I think it's a photojournalist's responsibility to navigate what's a performance for the camera and what's organically happening. What are the barriers to authenticity in a situation? And it's not the most straightforward thing in the world, of course, but I think it's an extremely important point to flag that could be a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be fascinating to have seen video from this moment, to have seen
Yeah,
how this moment
how it
emerged.
unfolded.
How did civilians get these people, end up taping them to posts and so on, to understand the context of that, to kind of see what's outside the frame or next to the frame on that.
Mhm.
I think that's extremely important. It reinforces exactly one of the key points that you're making in your approach to ethics, Savannah, which is how contextual these things are. And it's not possible just to say right, wrong, good, bad.
Mhm.
In some circumstances, this might be good. In some circumstances, might not be good, and so on, depending on what we see, what the purpose is, where it's going, etc.
Yeah.
You've got a campaign going at Photography Ethics Centre. Tell us a little bit about that, because it seems to me to embody your different approach to ethics as opposed to focusing on codes and guides and so on.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much. David, we've launched a campaign encouraging people across the photography industry to take the time to write about your own ethical approach in the form of a statement of ethics, and to publish it on your websites or your social media, or whatever your sort of main online platform is. We've created a pledge where people can go and pledge that you will be committing to doing this, that you will make it a priority. And this pledge is intended for really anyone who works with images. So that could be photographers, photo editors, curators, photo organizations, anyone who maintains a practice of working with lens-based media, really. And what we mean when we say a statement of ethics is really intended as it's a declaration of your ethical principles and a description of how you enact those principles. The purpose of it is to explore really for yourself what ethics means to you in your practice. So to take that time for reflection, to put it down on paper, but then also to share that commitment with others. And I think the sharing is really important, because it, first of all, signals to others that, ethics is important. It promotes ethical awareness across the industry. It encourages transparency of how we're working as photographers, which is incredibly important in terms of public trust for photojournalists. And it also fosters accountability. It sort of makes it public that, these are the things I stand for. And for example, in my own practice, I've written one, obviously, for my own practice, and I've put it out there and I'm working towards it. If I mess up, I hope to be held accountable to it, because it's something that I'm constantly working at honing and looking out for in my own practice. So for me personally, as a practitioner, I feel quite comfortable doing that. And I hope that others will as well.
Yeah. So Adrian, thank you. He's very helpfully put the link to the Petapixel article on your campaign in the chat there, so people can follow that up. And Clinton's put the Photo Ethics website address there, so that's really good. Just going back to the photo of the people caught looting, Adrian has said, you either trust the source or you don't. If still images are so subjective and we need video for context, then ... I guess, Adrian, I would just say, I'm not saying that every still image needs a video to be trusted or whatever, but there's no question that when you do see videos of circumstances and you see a still image, you understand the process or the flow behind the particular moment that's been captured in a still image. Of course, I trust Ron completely in this case. Doesn't stop me asking questions about the context in that, and it would be nice to see some other things. So I don't think it's a black and white trust, don't trust, and it's certainly not a demand that every photo has a video with it. Although I would say about that one of the interesting things, and this is playing out in Ukraine too, is that people who work with open source intelligence, organizations like Bellingcat and others, in a way, that's what they do, is that they locate other sources of information around images, not to question the images and so on, but simply to provide a much richer account. And I think that open source intelligence and the kind of visual stories you get out of those investigations units, putting those things together, is extraordinarily powerful for understanding these.
Yeah. Could I just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go on.
No, I was just gonna say to that point, and also to Laurent's point as well there about
Yeah,
taking a wider shot. I mean, I think all of these things are really helpful, really useful. I think it's, you know, wider, you know, if we have a close up and a wider shot, I think that that just gives the viewer more understanding of the context as well, which is, I think, a net positive. But I think the other thing that I would say about this, you know, yes, those, triangulation of
yeah,
information, very important. It's very important to have people and organizations who verify data.
yeah,
I guess the one thing that I would say is that to me, and at the Photography Ethics Center, what's most important to me is education. I think that we need to be able to trust photojournalists implicitly. You know, as you said that you trust Ron implicitly.
yeah,
I think we need to know that the people producing photographs have the skills to distinguish between if something's a
yeah,
performance for them or happening organically. I think we need people who have the skills to distinguish, whether someone is leading them down a path to photograph something specific.
yeah,
I guess it's not to discredit the work, at all of organizations that verify photographs. I think that is important. But I also think that there are limits. We can't, it's hard to verify everything.
yeah.
And I think if we can ensure that people have that knowledge, have those skills, are working ethically, I think that that would go a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're coming towards the end of our time. If someone wants to throw one or two more questions in, we could probably do those. Ted had a couple of questions. One was about, is something already being pursued in terms of editing images for possible future use in international criminal investigations? I'm not aware, Ted, of individual photographers doing that. I know, however, talking to the likes of Ron and Eric and so on, they're photographing with that in mind, and they're producing images with that in mind. Whether anyone's actually starting to put together dossiers and so on, I suspect not for photographers, but I think that maybe some of these open source investigators will be putting together files on these various things should the time come. Hopefully it will come. So yeah, I think that's all the questions that we can answer. Ted had another question about verifying information about captured Russian soldiers, but that's beyond my, I don't know whether we can verify the claim that you're talking about there, Ted. I don't have any information on that. Final, so Adrian's asking, so this will make this the final question. And I think the question is, what's the value, or is it good to embed photographs with time, place, camera, etc.? Well, obviously, images come with a certain amount of metadata already. But that's a very good point, Adrian, because actually I would then call attention to what Adobe is doing with what they call the Content Authenticity Initiative, which actually Seven did partner with. And if you email me, I can send you some links and some information on that. But this is, of course, Adobe being the creators of Photoshop that people used to shall we say, embellish images, and rightly so for graphic designers and so on. They're now establishing a workflow and a technology which allows people to really authenticate images, and so this data travels with images and becomes much more difficult to strip out and so on. It's a long way from being usable in the field yet, but there's a lot of progress on that front, and they're developing industry standards and so on. And I do think that this is something that is enormously important for these sorts of situations, that if you could enhance the amount of embedded information in a digital file that could not be removed, then verification becomes easier and open source investigators can use that. And actually Adobe's thing is also that media organizations will be able to have simple links on photos on websites where you could click and you could see this information just as a news consumer. So if people are interested in that, email me and I'll send you some more information on the Content Authenticity Initiative. But there are quite a lot of developments going on in that field, so something to watch out for.
It's a great initiative from Adobe. If I could just play devil's advocate, not really. I think the Adobe initiative is fantastic, but I think more broadly, just thinking about these things, not to sound like a broken record, but I do think that there's a lot of interest and a lot of excitement about technological solutions.
Yes.
I think that education is the primary solution. I mean, I think that is the fundamental, and I realize I'm at risk of repeating myself, but I do just want to flag that.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. There's not a single technological solution to these questions. There shouldn't be. These are political and cultural questions, ethical questions. They remain open for interpretation and so on. More metadata would be good to have in that conversation, but it's not going to end that conversation or solve that conversation.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
So, and that to me is what verification is about. Verification is that you find other sources of evidences to corroborate. And that's how we end up with knowledge in the end. As Clinton says, you can have all that metadata, you can have that stuff, and then someone will still claim that it was an actor, and that the scene, the metadata can tell you when the scene was and so on, but it can't tell you actually who's in the scene and so on.
Well, which is what happened with the woman who was in labor, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The very original claim that it's a crisis actor and so on. I mean, there must be a huge profession of crisis actors around the world if this is the case, you know. It clearly isn't the case. But yeah, that doesn't stop the claims. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And it's, you know, we haven't touched on this and we don't have time now, but this may be another thing to discuss later, is actually how on one side, Ukrainian authorities are using images, and on the other side, how Russian authorities are using images, because Ukrainians are reasonably savvy, and President Zelensky is particularly savvy in how he's using images and videos and so on to make the case. So yeah, that's something that we could touch on perhaps on another event, but I think we're pretty much out of time. We really appreciate everyone joining. Some fantastic questions today. Keep an eye on the 7 Insider blog, because we'll be posting more and more audio from photographers in Ukraine. I'm getting more people to write about what they're seeing in terms of imagery, and we hope that's very much going to be a site for information and promote some more debate.
Thank you very much for having me today, and thank you to everybody as well who's tuned in.
Yeah, thanks very much, Svenna. Take care. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.